So, it's my great pleasure to introduce Michael Krausz, whose work is well known to this audience, of course, and let me emphasize that he's also an artist and a conductor, and so has various artistic sensibilities and has thought a lot about the relation between science and art and philosophy, and I think some of this will also be covered in your talk with the title Relativism as Opposed to What? We're looking forward to this.
Thank you so much. Well, I also, of course, want to add my thanks to Dorothea and to Alyssa and to Michael and really all of the participants here who have made it such a fruitful gathering. As a matter of fact, I think a formal thank you is in order since this is the last session, the last time. I don't know whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing that I'm the last person, but we'll find out as we go along. Relativism as opposed to what? My principal aim in this paper is to show the relationships between varieties of relativism and their absolutist opposites. In so doing, I will reveal the invalidity of the classical self-referential argument against relativism. At the same time, it is not my aim to endorse any particular variety of relativism or absolutism. So first I begin with a definition. Let us begin with a working definition of relativism, which I believe captures its characteristic usages. Of course, there's a certain measure of legislation here, but it's the starting point. For present purposes, I shall define relativism as the claim that such values as truth, goodness, or beauty, or others is relative to a reference frame, and no absolute overarching standards to adjudicate between competing reference frames exist. Now, I'm going to be referring to this definition over and over again, so let me repeat it again. The claim that such values as truth, goodness, or beauty, etc., is relative to a reference frame, and no absolute overarching standards to adjudicate between competing reference frames exist. Now, this definition embeds numerous variables. They include values, such as truth, goodness, beauty, etc., reference frames, such as points of view, symbol systems, paradigms, cultures, etc., domains of inquiry, for example, nature versus culture and its cognates, levels, namely ontic or epistemic, conditions of adjudication, and varieties of absolutism that a relativist may negate. And by those I mean realism, universalism, or foundationalism. When unpacked and combined in various ways, these variables yield a myriad of relativisms. As we shall see, relativism is no one doctrine. So let us examine more closely these variables of relativism. I shall offer brief remarks about each of them in turn, and that'll be most of my paper, and I have other things to say after that inventory. Okay, first about values. Notice that our working definition of relativism allows that relativism may range over, for example, truth, goodness, or beauty, not truth, goodness, and beauty. One reason for the or rather than the and is that it allows for either global or piecemeal treatments of relativism. That is, one may affirm a relativism with respect to all values or with respect to only some values. For example, one might affirm a relativism with respect to truth, goodness, and beauty, or goodness and beauty but not truth, or goodness but not truth or beauty but not truth or goodness, or truth but not goodness or beauty, or neither truth, goodness, nor beauty. In short, one might take one's relativism on a value-by-value basis. Were one to admit yet more values, such as indeterminate, the permutations would be expanded still further. Second, relativism as to truth typically takes truth in a bivalent way. That is, truth and falsity are typically taken as mutually exclusive and exhaustive. Yet truth-like values, such as may be multi-valued. For example, pairs such as reasonableness and unreasonableness, aptness and inaptness, or appropriateness or inappropriateness, these are not mutually exclusive. In the moral realm, for example, we may speak of fairness or praiseworthiness in a multivalent way. In the aesthetic realm, we may speak of interesting or convincing in multivalent ways. Joseph Margolis, for example, urges the opposing judgments that would be contradictory on a bivalent logic turn out not to be so on a multivalent logic. Opposing judgments on a multivalent logic would be incongruent rather than more strongly contradictory. Accordingly, two opposed or incongruent judgments may be reasonable, appropriate, or apt. Third, on another point, note that while some values are typically associated with particular domains of inquiry, for example, beauty, with respect to the aesthetic domain, such values may also apply to other domains. For example, a solution to a mathematical or scientific problem may be considered to be beautiful, while moral or aesthetic claims may be taken to be true. So no necessary lineup between certain values and particular domains exist. Values and domains may overlap, but they need not be coextensive. Now, I move on to reference frames. Consider reference frames. They come in many varieties. Their cognates may include paradigms, symbol systems, worldviews, systems of belief, languages, points of view, perspectives, standpoints, forms of life, or conceptual schemes, and the list goes on. They may include cultures, tribes, communities, countries, civilizations, societies, historical periods, religions, races, genders. This list of cognates is not exhaustive. Neither are they mutually exclusive. Some of these cognates of reference frames overlap, some do not. Some of their boundaries are easily delineable, others are not. Sometimes we can easily distinguish what is inside and what is outside a reference frame. Sometimes we cannot. For example, the boundaries between Hindu and Buddhist traditions are vague, while those between medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque periods are indeterminate. Boundaries between guilt and shame cultures are difficult to delineate. Rising above reference frames. Absolutists might argue that the very diversity of reference frames could show up only in the first place, only if such diversity itself is frame independent. Correspondingly, relativists could not even assert relativism without first transcending it. That is to affirm that truth, goodness, or beauty is frame relative. For example, one must rise above frame relativity altogether. In this way, an absolutist might argue that relativism actually presupposes absolutism. But this argument is invalid because frame diversity may be noted within some larger reference frame. It does not follow that the relativist must rise above frame dependence as such. Relativists would need only to transcend their immediate reference frames to note the diversity of reference frames. It does not follow that one must rise above reference framedness per se. Put otherwise, rising above does not entail frame independence. Absolutists might press their case by observing that frames of reference are attached onto something, and that to which a frame attaches must be frame independent. It must be given absolutely. Yet a relativist may counter by suggesting that frames may attach to other frames. Accordingly, it would be a mistake to assume that there must be some frame-independent thing that reference frames are of. For example, there is no frame-independent fact of the matter, whether the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, that is, independent of a given geometry. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line in Euclidean geometry, but it isn't so in a non-Euclidean geometry, say in Riemannian geometry. Yet absolutists might press their point by affirming that such geometries are still about some frame-independent thing, namely space. That is, there must be something that diverse geometries are of. But the relativist might respond that space is but a postulated abstraction with no absolutist standing. It may be a subject without ostensive reference. Absolutists may press their point still further by conceding that while we may understand the world via reference frames, such reference frames distort or falsify our knowledge of the world. That is, frame negatively filter our access to the world, much like dirty eyeglasses might. Nevertheless, those who concede that reference frames may distort or falsify their vision of the world must postulate a frame-independent world, without which they could not understand the very idea of distortion or falsification. That is to say, they couldn't understand those notions in the first place. In reply, the relativist may insist that the idea of distortion or falsification does not require an absolutist construal, because what we take to know is always already framed. Put otherwise, one who embraces a coherentist rather than a correspondist theory of truth can agree that some statements are truer than others. Truer, that is, in virtue of their fittingness with a constellation of other entrenched frame-dependent beliefs. Such an approach would disallow talk of getting at or not getting at frame-independent matters. Domains. I turn now to domains of inquiry, to which relativism might apply. One might be relativist with respect to all domains or with respect to some domains. In this sense, a relativist may be global or piecemeal. Depending upon our purposes and interests, we may divide domains in numerous ways. For example, we may distinguish between such domains as nature and culture, or we might distinguish between such domains as logic and mathematics, natural science, social sciences, the humanities, and the arts. Or more finally, we may divide domains according to more traditional departmental disciplines such as mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, economics, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, law, politics, history, religion, languages, literatures, music, art, and so on. According to such departmental scheme, an individual could be relativist with respect to language and literature, art, or music, but absolutist with respect to mathematics or physics. Whichever taxonomy we might favor as regards domains, relativism with respect to some domains might be thought to be compatible with absolutism with other domains. Yet, in applying relativism in such a piecemeal way, an impediment arises for any of these taxonomies. That is, how should we separate pertinent domains? What joints exist that would separate them? Are the characterizations of such joints meant to capture frame-dependent facts of the matter, or are they meant to capture constructed cultural achievements? Are such joints found or made? For example, moral absolutists might object to characterizing morality in relativist terms, and scientific constructivists may object to characterizing science in absolutist terms. Indeed, might the construal of pertinent domains and their joints implicate relativist or absolutist dispositions to start with? does question beggingness loom? In this connection, we should note that relativism is not pluralism, and we've been using this word today and yesterday in different ways. So let me be clear how I'm using the word pluralism. I don't mean it quite in a sense of diversity. In this connection, let us consider the relation between relativism with pluralism in a special sense. Pluralism is here defined, affirms that for a given reference frame, a distinct subject matter or world exists. A pluralist could hold that for any paradigm, for example, another world exists. In contrast, relativism requires that, with respect to the same subject matter, competing reference frames exist. We had something of that suggestion in the discussion about Pythagoras. If a systematic plurality of subject matters or worlds answer to different reference frames, then pertinent frames could not compete. Competition between reference frames requires that they address the same thing, same in quotation marks. For example, Thomas Kuhn says, "There is, I think, no theory-independent way to reconstruct phrases like 'really there.' The notion of a match between the ontology of a theory and its, quote, 'real counterpart in nature' now seems to me elusive in principle." He says further, "The transition from Newtonian to Einsteinian mechanics illustrates with particular clarity the scientific revolution as a displacement of the conceptual network through which scientists view the world," end quote. Now, Kuhn verges, I say verges, on the pluralist view when he adds, quote, "Two groups, the members of which have systematically different sensations on reception of the same stimuli, do in some sense live in different worlds," end quote. Now, Kuhn's last remark hints that if different paradigms invoke different concepts to structure their subject matter, they cannot be about the same subject matter. Further, if they cannot be about the same subject matter, they cannot compete. Relativism, on the other hand, needs to reject the pluralist assumption of difference in concepts mandates difference in subject matter, for relativists affirm that different reference frames compete. Otherwise, adherents of different reference frames would be talking past each other. Under those conditions, the fact that no absolute standards exist to adjudicate between pertinent reference frames would be inconsequential. Once again, that last point is, I think, the summary of this paragraph. Under these conditions, the fact that no absolute standards exist to adjudicate between pertinent reference frames would be inconsequential. I turn now to levels. Another variable embedded in our definition of relativism involves ontic versus epistemic levels. A relativist at the ontic level embraces the relativity of objects of inquiry to reference frames. A relativist at the epistemic level embraces the relativity of our knowledge of objects of inquiry. So, a global relativist at the ontic level affirms that all objects of inquiry are frame-dependent, and a piecemeal relativist at the ontic level affirms that only some such objects are frame-dependent. In turn, a relativist at the epistemic level embraces the relativity of our knowledge of such objects to reference frames. A global relativist at the epistemic level affirms that our knowledge of all objects is frame-dependent, and a piecemeal relativist at the epistemic level affirms that our knowledge of only some objects is frame-dependent. Yet, the distinction between ontic and epistemic levels is contentious. Just to start with, before we do these permutations, the very concept of that, the very distinction is contentious. A relativist may hold out that if we have no access to objects of inquiry as such, that is, frame-independent objects, we cannot compare our descriptions of such objects with those objects as such. At best, we have access to the world and its objects only through some description or depiction of them. We can know them only as conceptualized in one way or another. Therefore, we can compare our descriptions only with other descriptions. The most that we can establish is a relationship between descriptions, not a relationship between descriptions and the world's supposed objects as such. Thus, one might conclude that the notion of the world and its objects as such is of no use in inquiry. Correspondingly, a relativist might argue that the very distinction between the ontic and epistemic levels is of no use in the conduct of inquiry. Notice that the view that the ontic-epistemic distinction serves no purpose in the conduct of inquiry does not entail that no world or its objects exists. Let me say that again. Notice that the view that the ontic-epistemic distinction serves no purpose in the conduct of inquiry does not entail that no world or its objects exist. That view does not deny that a frame-independent world and its objects exist somehow, in some way. Rather, it recommends that we should not invoke it in our inquiries. In any event, an ontic absolutist might counter that positing the notion of a frame-independent world does indeed serve a useful purpose. Without it, there would be no point at all in pursuing our inquiries to start with. Without it, one could make no sense of the idea of progress, for example, in the history of science. Ironically, it is now realist absolutist Karl Popper who says, in a very, very ambiguous way, he says the following: within methodology, we do not have to presuppose metaphysical realism. Let me emphasize, within methodology, we do not have to presuppose metaphysical realism, nor can we, I think, derive much help from it, although he would like to get some help from it, except of an intuitive kind. For once we have been told that the aim of science is to explain, and that the most satisfactory explanation will be the one that is most severely testable and most severely tested, we know all that we need to know as methodologists. That the aim is realizable, we cannot assert, nor without the help of metaphysical, once again, that the aim is realizable, we cannot assert, neither with nor without the help of metaphysical realism, which can give us some intuitive encouragement, some hope, but no assurance of any kind. And although a rational treatment of methodology may be said to depend upon an assumed or conjectured aim of science, it certainly does not depend upon the metaphysical and most likely false assumption that the true structural theory of the world, if any, is discoverable by man or expressible in human languages. Now, it's quite clear that Popper characterizes himself as an absolutist, particularly not just an absolutist, but a very strong realist. And he says, a metaphysical realist, and he says, it doesn't help in any methodological way. It gives us some hope. I leave it for you to judge whether or not it really even does that. Further on adjudication. Let us now turn the variable of adjudication in our definition of relativism. Notice that our definition allows the possibility of a single frame of all frames, an imperial reference frame, so to speak. Such an imperial frame would subsume all lower-level reference frames. For the relativist, this is an anomaly. For as our definition suggests, relativism concerns the non-adjudicability between reference frames. If finally only one imperial reference frame exists, the relativist's claim about adjudication between reference frames becomes inapplicable. That may not be a bad thing for relativists, as they are concerned to deny the existence of absolute standards to adjudicate among a plurality of reference frames. That the question of adjudication does not arise in the case of an imperial reference frames is no demerit for the relativist. Now we should ask, what sort of existence, ENTS, what sort of existence might or might not be capable of adjudicating at all? What about indeterminate, frame-independent order and undifferentiated unity like Kant's noumenon? Can its invocation adjudicate between reference frames? I suggest that saying with Kant that, for example, an indeterminate order and I know not what exists provides no praxial basis to adjudicate between reference frames. Interestingly, a relativist could, without contradiction, embrace such an indeterminate order of things. That is, a relativist might affirm the existence of something like Kant's noumenon, recognizing that such an order is unable to adjudicate between reference frames. Insofar as the definition of relativism involves adjudicability, this is an entirely independent matter. This finding, interestingly, is also holds for the Brahman or the oneness as invoked by the Advaita Hindu. More fully, Advaitists embrace the notion that ultimate reality is the inherent, undifferentiated, non-countable, ineffable one. That notion affirms that ultimate reality is the totality of existence and not any or all of its conventionally constituted countable objects. That notion, too, would be incapable of adjudicating between competing reference frames. So understood, appeal to the one could do no adjudicatory work, including adjudicating between reference frames. As in the case of Kant's noumenon, the relativist may, without contradiction, embrace the Advaita's one. To some, the noumenon of Kant or the oneness of the Advaita may look, quote, absolutist in some sense of absolutist, but it is not the sense of absolutism that is invoked in our definition of relativism. So then, in what sense of absolutism is then invoked here? It is now time to turn our attention to the varieties of absolutism that relativists characteristically negate. The second part of our definition states, once again, no absolute overarching standards to adjudicate between competing reference frames exist. What more precisely might a relativist negate? My answer to this question will bear directly upon the issue of whether the classical self-referential argument against relativism is valid. But first, I need to set out those senses of absolutism. Absolutism is variously comprised of at least three distinguishable intertwining strands: realism, universalism, and foundationalism. A strong absolutism will affirm all three. A weaker absolutism will affirm two. A still weaker absolutism will affirm only one. In turn, a strong relativism will negate all three. A weaker relativism will negate two, and a still weaker relativism will negate only one. Okay, so what about realism? By realism, I mean the view that frame-independent facts of the matter exist. It is the view that Karl Popper calls metaphysical realism. This view accords with that of John Searle, who says realism is realism is the view that there is a way that things are that is logically independent of human representations. Realism does not say how things are, but only that there is a way that they are. End quote. Notice that realism as frame independence applies to countable objects as well as to Kant's noumenon or the Advaita's Brahman or oneness. for frame independence may be a feature of a non-countable indeterminate realm. Now, relativists may speak of facts, but when they do so, they clearly mean it in a sense different from the realist sense. The relativist is free to say, for example, that it is a fact again that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, understanding by that such a claim is made within the reference frame of Euclidean geometry. So we should not presume that any talk of facts mandates a realist construal. We should not force an absolutist construal on facts upon the relativist. Accordingly, Nelson Goodman, who calls himself a radical relativist with restraints, says, quote, "We cannot find any world features independent of all versions. Whatever can be said truly of a world is dependent on the saying, informed by and relative to the language or other symbol system we use," end quote. Now, for universalism. The second strand of absolutism is universalism. Universalists may hold that certain non-trivial characteristics apply to all peoples at all times in all cultures. I say peoples because I don't want to say that all individuals do. Such characteristics may be frame independent or not. In the moral domain, for example, universalists hold that human rights exist for all peoples, regardless whether such rights are frame dependent. In contrast, anti-universalists hold that some non-trivial characteristics apply only to some peoples at some times in some cultures. They may claim that some human rights, for example, exist for some peoples and not for others. At its epistemic level, universalists assert that people in all cultures and in all times can know whether all peoples share pertinent characteristics, for rationality itself is universally exemplified. At the epistemic level, anti-universalists hold that such knowledge does not obtain for all peoples. They could argue that sometimes incommensurability between reference frames blocks universalism. For example, those of shame cultures in traditional Japan cannot fully understand those of guilt cultures in contemporary America and vice versa. At the epistemic level, anti-universalists may conclude that the search for universal language is futile. At that level, an anti-universalist could affirm that there are no universal grounds for deliberation shared by all peoples at all times and in all cultures. Now, I want to distinguish between universalism as an existential claim from universalism as a regulative principle. While the existential universalist asserts that universal commensurating resources exist, the regulative universalist affirms that it is useful to conduct one's inquiry as if the existential condition exists without actually affirming and assuming that the existential condition exists. It's a good idea as a leading principle to adopt, but there is no existential commitment made thereby. For we might overcome cross-cultural antagonisms, for example, if we adopt universalism as a regulative principle if we do not embrace universalism in its existential version. Regulative universalism may at least encourage cross-cultural dialogue, or the conditions under which cross-cultural dialogue can be fostered. Foundationalism. By way of introducing our third strand of absolutism, namely foundationalism, I distinguish between two kinds of universalism. I'm leaning on universalism now. Namely, foundational universalism and non-foundational universalism. Foundational universalism holds that all peoples share some common characteristics by virtue of what inherently, intrinsically, or ultimately it is to be a human being. These conditions are not just universal conditions, but they are inherent, intrinsic, and ultimate. Non-foundational universalism holds that all peoples share common characteristics without presuming that they do so by virtue by virtue of what it is to be a human being. Foundational universalism is a claim of inherence, intrinsicality, or ultimacy. In contrast, non-foundational universalism is a claim of historical or cultural biological contingency. In short, foundationalism is the view that characteristics of pertinent subjects are what they are in virtue of their being inherent, intrinsic, or ultimate of to those subjects. At the epistemic level, knowledge of foundational conditions can be acquired in virtue of the first principles, such as the principle of non-contradiction. They are self-evident and not further reducible. In this sense, foundationalism presupposes that there must be a terminus to any stage of justification, without which there would be an infinite regress. So consider two examples of foundational universalism. First, consider the claim, all persons have biological mothers. All persons have biological mothers. This example would amount to a foundational universalism if it were tied to the claim that having a biological mother is an inherent or intrinsic or ultimate feature of what it is to be a human being. In contrast, a non-foundational universalist might urge that the fact that all persons have biological mothers is contingent, and, considering possible developments in human cloning, it could be otherwise. Contingently understood, universal commonality does not amount to a foundational universalism. A universalist might reply that the mere universal instantiation of characteristics that all people might share, for example, having human rights or natural mothers, needs to be foundationally grounded. It needs to be foundationally grounded, at least to explain the otherwise miraculous fact of universality. That is, without foundational universalism, the commonality of shared characteristics seems miraculous. Foundationalism opposes a particular version of non-foundationalism, which I call polymorphism. Polymorphism denies that an inherent, intrinsic, or ultimate reference frame exists. For example, if we describe water in a glass as thirst-quenching, we might take that description as a truth about objects of the world. As a middle-sized phenomenon, water affords certain satisfactions to middle-sized organisms like human beings, dogs, and cats. Yet when we redescribe what is in a so-called glass in terms of electrons in empty space, the property of thirst-quenchingness does not apply. As well, at continued levels of analysis or magnification will reveal ever further constituents of pertinent phenomena. Polymorphism holds that relevant properties must be understood elliptically, that is, at a certain level of description or within a certain reference frame. Moreover, no level of description is ultimate. No level of description captures ultimate constituents of what there is. Interestingly, this polymorphic view is shared by such diverse thinkers as Nelson Goodman and Tibetan Buddhists. I don't know about Nelson Goodman's familiarity with Buddhism, but I'm struck by the parallel. The latter hold that nothing exists inherently, all is empty of inherent existence. That does not mean, though, that nothing exists. It only means that what does exist does so conventionally. Consider an aesthetic case in which realism, universalism, and foundationalism might apply. For example, some might say that the geometric proportions exhibited in the cross-section of the chamber nautilus, the beautiful shell, exemplifies aesthetically perfect proportions, formalized in the Fibonacci number series. In that series, the following series is 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, etc. Starting with 3, Once again, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. Starting with 3, any number is the sum of the previous two numbers. The aesthetic realist takes the series as embodying a perfect proportion independent of reference frames. In contrast, anti-realists of this kind hold that the series is frame-dependent. Whether frame-independent or dependent, the foundationalist takes the series to be rock-bottom, unanalyzable, self-evident. The non-foundationalist denies such basicality. Either way, whether realist or non-realist, foundational or non-foundational, universalists take the series to be universally instantiated, while anti-universalists deny such universality. What then is the relation between the three strands of absolutism: realism, universalism, and foundationalism? I'm just going to have to assert this. I can't give the arguments now. Realism, universalism, and foundationalism are compatible with each other. At the same time, realism entails neither universalism nor foundationalism. Universalism entails neither realism nor foundationalism, and foundationalism entails neither realism or universalism. These are independent positions. As mentioned, the strongest relativist position negates realism, universalism, and foundationalism. The strongest absolutist position embraces realism, universalism, and foundationalism. More moderate positions may combine these strands of absolutism in moderating or conciliatory ways. Notice that the moderate version of absolutism and relativism incorporate both absolutist and relativist strands. I'm glad I'm a middle-sized organism who now can get some thirst-quenching properties. Okay, now for the invalidity of the self-referential argument. We are now in a position to revisit the classical argument against relativism, which holds that relativism is self-refuting. More fully, if a relativist says relativism is true, we may inquire in what sense of truth he intends the claim to be received. If the sense of truth our relativist interlocutor invokes is absolutist, the claim is self-referentially contradictory. This charge of self-contradiction is often taken to be decisive. It is this apparent contradiction that is my main concern now. As an aside first, though, we may note other ineffectual ways a relativist might try to avoid the putative contradiction. A relativist might affirm that relativism is relatively true. However, this adjustment does not fare very well, for to say that relativism is relatively true can carry with it no recommendation why someone outside the relativist reference frame should take the relativist seriously. Relativism, so modified, ceases to have argumentative traction. Alternatively, to avoid the problem of contradiction, a relativist might seek to limit the scope of application of the claim of relativism. Accordingly, the relativist might urge all statements are relatively true except for the statement that the statement of relativity is relatively true. But this self-exempting strategy seems ad hoc and arbitrary. So now let us return to the charge of self-contradiction when relativism is said to be absolutely true. Having untangled the strands of absolutism, in realism, universalism, and foundationalism, we are now equipped with the resources to unseat the charge of contradiction more fully. Recall our initial definition of relativism. Quote, relativism is the claim that such values as truth, goodness, or beauty is relative to a reference frame, and now, no absolute overarching standards of adjudication between competing reference frames exist. It's the second part of that definition now that becomes important. Now, for the term absolute, in the latter part of our definition, let us substitute the disentangled strands, realist, universalist, or foundationalist. Such a substitution yields the following more explicit formulation of relativism as the view that such values as truth, goodness, or beauty as relative reference frame, and no realist, universalist, or foundationalist overarching standards to adjudicate between reference frames exists. Here, the phrase realist, universalist, or foundationalist substitutes for, quote, absolutism. One may have philosophical misgivings about realism or about universalism or foundationalism as they stand. Nevertheless, what is clear is that no contradiction follows when the relativist negates any one or all of these. Neither the negation of realism, nor the negation of universalism, nor still the negation of foundationalism is self-contradictory. Once we actually give a more refined formulation of the second half of that definition, the term absolutist doesn't even appear, and we don't get the impression that there's a self-contradiction here. Put otherwise, if we conceive of relativism as a negation of one or more of the strands of relativism, relativism is not self-refuting. If we disentangle absolutism into each of these individual strands, the self-refuting argument against relativism dissolves. QED. Of course, this argument does not establish the rightness of absolutism. It only shows the ineffectiveness of the classical self-referential argument against relativism. So here then is my general conclusion. We should defer the question, who is right, the relativist, the absolutist, or neither. Rather, we should first ask, which relativism, and which strand of relativism, and which strand of absolutism does it negate? For as we've seen, relativism is no one doctrine. Thank you.